the Black Dahlia. What a doozy we have today. Not only because I'm needing to rely on TikTok so I can film this due to my technical difficulties, I'm not going to go into it, but the Black Dahlia indeed is a case and a half. And I'm not saying that to be ironic or whatever. It's because I genuinely thought I knew this case. I'm a true crime buff. I have been for many years. But turns out what I know is the sensationalized, essentially ball poop that a lot of people from the 40s onwards have put out there, either, to sell papers, for media purposes, rumors based, hearsay. The only person that really studied and used so much time to go through this case, and I mean comprehensively, putting hours upon hours and years upon years into trying to figure out what did happen to Elizabeth Short, is a man called Larry Harnisch. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Larry Harnisch is a writer and a journalist who has worked in writing and journalism for 30 years. And he is the reason why I actually was able to do this research and find out some information that was actually based not only in fact, but then leads us to eventually find out who we believe was the actual killer of Elizabeth Short. And just a little spoiler for you, it's not who Steve Hodel, the person who accused his father of being the killer. It's not his father. And there's many reasons. All you have to do, because I'm not going too much into Steve Hodel, he's had his TV shows, he's had his limelight, he's written his books. He also accused his father of being the Zodiac killer. And he wrote books about that as well, and he is a best-selling author now. So if you want to know about his version of events, then I would just say Google Steve Hodel debunked, and you will find out why I'm not really going to waste my time going into his information and why he believes his father was the killer. By no means was his father a good man, but the likelihood of him being the Black Dahlia killer is slim to none. So I'm not going to waste our time. But what I will say is that Elizabeth Short had a turbulent life quite early on. She was born in Medford, Massachusetts on July 29th, 1924. From the tender age of 5, the Great Depression hit. And like many Americans of the time, her family was greatly affected. Her father, Cleo Short, used to build miniature golf courses. And as a result, he had a good business and their life was decent. But once the Great Depression came along, his business went completely bust and he couldn't rely on making that money anymore. And unfortunately, he abandoned Elizabeth and the family. What we do know next is that later in Elizabeth's life, she ends up moving to Florida. And this is due to her actually having quite bad asthma. So she moves to a warmer climate to get away from the cold, brutal Massachusetts winters. Unfortunately, from that moment, Betty's life wasn't really ever stable again. She almost lived the life of a nomad from that point, relying on some family, but mostly friends, and living off the kindness of strangers. She would kind of float from place to place, what I guess we'd call these days couch surfing. Now, that wasn't completely unheard of at the time, because as Betty got older and we move into the later years of her very short life, obviously we have the world wars that happened, World War One and World War Two, and there was a housing crisis. So she wouldn't have been the only one, but there was zero to none when it came to stability in Betty. The way the papers portray Betty is, in certain terms, they said she was a sex worker. She was not. They said that she worked as a waitress at the time of her killing. She didn't. She was actually unemployed. She didn't have any employment. She literally lived off the kindness of strangers, and for a short time period, very short time period, she got some money from her father, who she became in contact with for a short period of time when she very first moved to LA, but she didn't stay there for very long. She actually moved back to Florida because they did not have a close relationship. So when they talk about Betty, and just like I mentioned in the short on TikTok, we have this sensationalized view of this very seductive woman who came to LA to be a film star. That isn't why she came to LA at all. Initially, she came to live with her father, then she went back to Florida, and then she returns at LA to date, which we will get into. But Betty may have said a lot of things about why she wanted to be a film star or what career she wanted to go into. But one of the things that was discovered by Larry and has been also said by close friends of hers over the years is that Betty sometimes used to kind of twist the truth and lie to garner sympathy. And not that that's a great thing to do, but it by no means makes her a bad person. And not that there's any shame at all in being a sex worker, but she wasn't. That's not what she did. And there is no evidence of her going to casting calls. There's no evidence of her going to auditions or meeting with directors at all. So, again, there may have been a time where she mentioned it, but that wasn't something she was actively pursuing. Also, at the time when Betty was out and about with friends, she did enjoy socializing. One of the main reasons is because when she'd go on a date and be able to go dating, she would get dinner bought for her. And like I said, she relied on the kindness of strangers and relied on her friends to get by more often than not. But of course, the media portrayed her as this party girl, almost this floozy that would go out with anyone. That wasn't the case. And in fact, the big relationship of her life that is often referred to later on down the line was disproved by the man's mother. But again, we will get into that as well. Betty's friends, in fact, describe Betty as well-behaved, sweet, kind, and somebody who would often find themselves in, as they put it, hot water. In fact, one of her friends actually said, unfortunately, she landed herself in hot water often and stumbled into trash. I don't know if she means people. I'm assuming she means trashy people. Another friend of hers, who was a man, said that she was a bit of a tease because she enjoyed making me feel bashful. She thought it was funny and she liked to see my face turn crimson. I think that is the most that can be said about Betty being a floozy, which, again, I understand it was the 40s, but the papers in particular, one paper in particular, the Examiner, was just relentless and morally and ethically dubious. Probably the most out of the four major papers that were circulating. It was actually thanks to the Examiner and a man called William Randolph Hearst that people believed that Betty was killed by a serial killer at the time. He was the one that sensationalized the case to such a magnitude that people thought there was a serial killer on the loose. However, the question over many, many years has then been asked, why was there never another killing like Betty's then in LA, or anywhere else for that matter? And that will bring me on to the very sad and gruesome facts of how Elizabeth Short was found. Betty was found on the morning of January 15th, 1947, by a woman that was walking through a highly populated neighbourhood in Inglewood. This woman's name was incidentally also Betty, and she was walking early in the morning. Some people say she was walking her dog or walking with a child. However, there's no evidence of that either. At first, she thought she saw a literal mannequin. That's what she described. Then she quickly realised that it was a human being, and she realised the state that this human being had been left in, which was tragic to her. Elizabeth Short had been cut in half, but so precisely that it had not disturbed any of her internal organs. As a matter of fact, she had been drained of blood, completely washed clean, and been left with a Chelsea smile. To describe a Chelsea smile, all I can compare it to is the Joker's smile, if you would like to imagine that, as I'm not going to show what it looks like. However, that is the condition that Betty's body was left in, and because it had been washed clean, completely clean, there was no evidence on the body. When Betty did return to Florida, it wasn't just because her and her father fell out, it was also because she got arrested and had to return to Florida. The reasons for her arrest I wasn't able to find out. However, that was in 1944. And during that time, after she was released in Florida, she actually met a man, and this is the man that is often referred to as the love of her life, the one whom I referred to earlier on as being disproved later by his own mother. But his name was Major Matthew Gordon Jr., and in fact, he was a US Army Air Force pilot and said to be a very charming, intelligent, nice man. There is a picture of them two together on a date, so it's not to say that they never met one another, but Betty had told people that they were due to be engaged, to be married, and that sadly he actually died in combat when he was away during World War II. And he did die, he did indeed unfortunately lose his life. However, they weren't engaged to be married, and later on, um, Gordon's mother actually said that she never heard of Betty until her death. She never met her, and that her son wasn't engaged to anyone when he went off to war. In 1946, Betty again returned to LA with another man who happened to be a pilot that she was dating at the time, and his name was Lieutenant Joseph Gordon Fickling. However, not much is known about their relationship either, just that they did date for a short period of time. And at that point, Betty remained in LA. As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, Betty led a very unstable life and quite a nomad lifestyle. When she did move back to LA after her relationship, or she stopped dating the lieutenant, she did stay with a man called Mark Hansen in his apartments, and she rented a space there from time to time for a few months. However, she didn't stay there very long. Shortly after that, she moved to the Horton Hotel and she lived there for some time. And after that, she ended up in the Chancellor Apartments. And apparently, the Chancellor Apartments are the only building out of the three main ones that we know Betty stayed at that are still standing to this day. It's said that this unstable and changeable situations was due to the fact that Betty was unemployed, as I mentioned earlier. She wasn't a waitress at the time of her passing. She didn't have a job whatsoever. She did just rely on people helping her, and some would be people she would meet out and about. Some would be people that she would meet in a club slash bar that she used to like to attend that Mark Hansen actually ran at the time. Now, when it comes to the name the Black Dahlia, why was she given that name? The papers took credit for that name, and in particular, the Examiner took credit for that name. However, it has actually been said, and this is through Larry's extensive research, that she was given the name the Black Dahlia apparently by customers of a pharmacy that she used to often frequent in Long Beach. She used to go in there so often, and due to the style of her hair and the flowers she wore in her hair, and the fact that there was a film noir movie out at the time called The Blue Dahlia, and because Betty had jet black hair, they called her the Black Dahlia. Because initially the papers referred to Betty's murder as the werewolf killing or the werewolf slaying. They didn't refer to her as the Black Dahlia. But once they heard that nickname, that is what caught on like wildfire, and all the other papers at the time picked up and used that nickname, which has then gone on to be used, and her story twisted and misinterpreted in books and movies over the years. Towards the end of Betty's short life, she actually moved in with the French family. That was their name. And they lived in San Diego. And she lived with them for a few months. However, they also would say, much like her father mentioned, that she was out and about more often than not. She was hardly ever home. She was socializing, she was with friends. And as I mentioned earlier, she would go on dates, and she would go with her friends as well on dates, like in groups, so that she could meet people and also potentially meet somebody that she maybe be able to have a relationship with and fall in love with. Not to say that she was necessarily looking for love, but she did enjoy being around people. And her and Robert were indeed very close. They actually became very good friends, and their relationship was just described as extremely close. We don't know the details. However, what we do know is that he actually offered her a job and set up a job interview for her. Unfortunately, she would never make that job interview. It is also said that Robert Manley was the last person to see Betty alive other than the killer. That night, when the French family actually evicted Betty, she called Robert, who came to pick her up, and he drove her back to LA, all the way back to the Biltmore Hotel, which was actually on very late on the night of January 9th, 1947. And that was the last time Robert saw Betty. She went into the hotel, and after that is when the tragic event occurred 6 days later. So what happened with Betty during those 6 days? She didn't have any contact with known friends. She didn't have any contact with her family. Not that she was particularly close with them, but she didn't have any contact with her mother Phoebe, her father, or Robert. Now we come to looking at who could have possibly have done this to Betty. The horrific condition she was found in has been described that as she was obviously cut into two direct pieces, it was done with surgical precision. So they reported at the time, and it was noted, that this was not done haphazardly, and this could only be done by somebody who knew the anatomy of the human body. As I mentioned earlier, none of her internal organs were disturbed. The other factor is how clean the body was. The body was washed completely clean of even fingerprints, not even the slightest errant hair of belonging to somebody else. So when she was found on the 15th, she was found in that condition, looking as though she had been left for somebody to find, because it wasn't a remote area. It was a high traffic area. It was a neighborhood. It wasn't hidden away somewhere. She'd been left on display. But again, why? Why would somebody commit such a horrific crime, one that then wasn't replicated or seen like that ever again, and leave her in such a high traffic area? Another thing to note is that there were ligature marks found on Betty's wrists and ankles, and the cause of death was actually deemed to be significant head trauma and multiple lesions on her face and neck. So when she was actually dismembered and the blood drained, was done post-mortem. Now, very sadly, Phoebe Short was informed of her daughter's untimely and tragic demise, not by the LAPD, but by the paper, The Examiner. And the way they went about it was particularly disgusting, in my opinion. Two journalists from The Examiner, Jimmy Richardson and Wayne Sutton, actually called Phoebe Short to inform them that their daughter, Elizabeth Short, had won a beauty contest, and they wanted to find out more about, her lovely daughter for this information for the piece in the paper about the beauty contest. Which, not only when you think about it, is a ridiculous thing to say and do, but considering the circumstances, is callous and beyond morally dubious. So these two characters tried to do that, and they tried to get some information out of Phoebe Short. However, they didn't really get what they wanted out of her, and because they couldn't pry any juicy details that they wanted, they just very bluntly and very callously told her, no, your daughter didn't win a beauty pageant or a beauty contest. In fact, she's dead. And that is how Phoebe Short found out about the horrific, horrible crime that was committed to her daughter, Elizabeth Short. There have, of course, been over 100 suspects over the years, from the 40s to modern day, of who could possibly have committed this horrific crime against Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. Now, I'm not going to go through every single suspect for obvious reasons. There's over 100 of them. But also, I'm not going to go into extreme detail on the main suspects. I will cover them, but there is another video that I will add in the description that goes into great detail on all the suspects if you are interested in them in particular. But I'm just going to cover them as a whole. So, looking at the suspect list, the first one we come to is the person who was last with Elizabeth Short when she was last seen alive, and that is Robert Manley. Now, Robert Manley was very quickly found not to be guilty and dismissed as a suspect. We don't know the full details around it, but one of them, we believe it's because he wasn't even in the location around that time period once he had dropped Elizabeth off. Now, unfortunately, Robert Manley did have quite significant mental health issues, depression being one of them, and that's why he was honourably discharged from the war. However, because he was accused and interviewed and interrogated so much about possibly being one of the suspects, he was then later institutionalised. So he also did not have a very good ending to his story either. Another one that in our long line of suspects is person mentioned earlier as well, Mark Hansen. So he's the person who owned the nightclub and also the apartment that Betty stayed in for some time. Now, Betty actually stayed with Mark Hansen twice, and people would speculate about their relationship as well, trying to make it out to be something that it wasn't. But in fact, Mark Hansen was married and his wife lived there also. He had 2 spare rooms, and it wasn't uncommon during the time that she stayed with him, especially the second time. It was just after World War II, when I mentioned earlier there was a significant housing crisis, and people would allow other people to either rent rooms from them or stay with them for short periods for free until they could kind of get back up on their feet. So there wasn't a relationship between them. Mark Hansen was described as a flirt, and because he was a club owner, he probably did mix with a lot of women. However, there is no proof there was any romantic or any kind of relationship between him and Betty other than her renting from him. And actually, the only reason that she actually moved out the final time she was living with him was because a friend of hers was staying as well, and Mark Hansen and his wife really did not like this friend at all. They took a distinct disliking to her, and as a result, Betty left with her friend. Now, there were a lot of rumours that went on about Mark as well, that he was a mob boss, that he was involved with the mafia, that he was a gangster, this, that, the other. None of that was true either. Significantly, it was actually said, and Larry Harnisch goes into detail on this, and if you do ever look into his work, which I advise if you're interested in this case, because he is a fountain of knowledge when it comes to the Black Dahlia. But it was actually said that at the time there was like almost 2 kind of tribes when it came to mafias, one being Jewish and one being Italian. Mark Hansen was neither, so he wouldn't have been allowed in anyway. Maybe it's because they possibly frequented his club, but I doubt that he had any connection whatsoever. So that is the second suspect that we know of. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go into mountains of detail on each suspect, even the main ones. I will mention them, but like I mentioned earlier, I will attach and link the video to a different channel that does go into extensive detail on each suspect if you really want to get to know each one individually. They don't do all 100, of course, but they do go into a lot more detail, and it's a great channel. So if you're interested in that, I will link that in the description and you can check them out. But the next person we are coming to is a man by the name of Leslie Dillon. Now, he was said to have some connection to Betty, and actually he was treated horrifically by the police. He was given truth serum, which was controversial, and he wasn't the only one that this was done to during this case and other cases that occurred around that time. But he was also beaten and just treated really disrespectfully and damaged mentally and physically, and it actually resulted in him suing, and he won his court case. So he was also dismissed and let go and not considered to be the killer of Elizabeth Short. Now, after him, there was also people who later on down the line would also suspect the lipstick killer. And again, the papers would throw this around. Now, the lipstick killer is a video all of its own, but he was a very young man with significant mental health issues, who was no angel by any means, but some people do believe they actually got the wrong person, whereas other people believe that the lipstick killer wasn't even a serial killer, that the three women that had been killed allegedly by the lipstick killer were three separate murders, as the MOs did not match at all. And even the lipstick killer's writing was matched to the writing of the alleged main suspect who was arrested for the crime, and they even didn't think his writing matched. They got an analyst in, they did polygraph him as well, and truth serum him also. However, both those were dubious. Both those were said not to be allowed in court anyway. And as we know, with polygraph tests, even today, let alone back then, they are something like 80 to 85% in terms of being, correct. So that's why they aren't admissible in court. So the lipstick killer was one person that was considered. Another serial killer that was genuinely a serial killer that's still an unsolved case was the torso killer. Now the torso killer was considered because, by the name, he left behind the torso and dismembered bodies. And he went after vagrants and vagabonds and homeless people. Now, even though Elizabeth was technically homeless and she was somewhat of a nomad, she was by no means a vagrant, and he also used to find and get and leave his victims around railway tracks, train tracks and stations and the like, which again was very different to Elizabeth's situation, because with Elizabeth, she was left somewhere with a high traffic area, highly populated, out in the open, for definitely somebody to see and find. Whereas the torso killer used to hide his victims. So again, that was quickly dismissed and ruled out. Now, I briefly did mention earlier about Steve Huddle. I'm not going to go into great detail on him. He accused his father, George Huddle, because he found two pictures that he believed to be the Black Dahlia in his father's things when his father died in 1999. Please, if you would like, Google Steve Huddle debunked. George Huddle, of course, was a horrible man by the evidence they have found on him and what he did. But that, again, in my opinion, George Huddle is a separate case. And Steve Huddle's claims about him being the Black Dahlia killer, as well as allegedly the Zodiac killer, have been debunked by many an armchair detective and also other professionals. So I'm not going to go into his theories on why his father could have possibly have been a suspect. Another suspect on the list was a man by the name of Joseph Dumais. Now, Joseph Dumais actually confessed to the Black Dahlia murder. He went ahead and spoke to the police directly and took the blame for all of it. However, it was very quickly deemed to be a false confession. Now, anyone who kind of is a big fan of true crime knows that many people do actually falsely confess to crimes that they don't commit for a variety of reasons. Some is for notoriety, fame, infamy, some mental health issues, some it's because they have quite a twisted, desperate need for attention. But he was very quickly dismissed, and it was found to be completely false. And therefore, Joseph Dumais, even though he's on the suspect list down the line, along with many others, he is not the person that killed the Black Dahlia. Now, that brings us to the most likely, and who I also agree with Larry Harnisch and a few others that have extensively looked into this case, who the actual murderer of Elizabeth Short was. And this is a man by the name of Walter Bailey. And get ready for this one, because when I go into Walter, his whole backstory and what lines up with a profile that was also put together by the great John E. Douglas, who wrote Mindhunter, that was turned into the popular Netflix series. The profile and Walter Bailey and the whole circumstances. So, let me introduce you to how Walter Bailey, pictured here, became the main and most likely suspect in the search for Betty Short's killer. Again, I would like to reiterate that this is with huge thanks to the tireless and comprehensive work of Larry Harnisch, which, please, if you look him up, he's pictured right here. He has a whole website and you can go far down the rabbit hole as you please. But this is Larry. So Larry stated that on the 50th anniversary of the Black Dahlia's death, he wanted to find out more. He was trying his best to figure out, I think this would have been when would have turned 75 years old, and he was being sent in many, many letters from people and resources and theories and so on. And whilst most of these weren't of actually any use to Larry, during the process he did decide that he was going to liaise with and consult the aforementioned John E. Douglas. Now, pictured here, as you can see, on the left is the real Johnny Douglas, and on the right is the Johnny Douglas that was portrayed in the Netflix series Mindhunter. So, he was a legend in his field and had a significant role in catching both the Atlanta child killer and the Trailside killer, which were huge cases. And thanks to his numerous extensive interviews with serial killers over the years, such as was shown in the Netflix series Mindhunter and discussed in his book, this is the reason why profiling became as pivotal in the progress of studying the mind of a killer and helping to catch many a killer. He interviewed the likes of Ted Bundy, Ed Kemper, John Wayne Gacy, Charles Manson, and even the son of Sam killer, David Berkowitz. Douglas went on to put a profile together for who he thought could possibly be the killer of the Black Dahlia. Now, the following has been abbreviated of the exact version, and I believe the exact version is available on Larry's website. However, this is an abbreviation, and it reads as follows. Douglas's profile on his thought to be a white man no younger than his 20s, possibly older. That he works better with his hands than with his mind. He claimed this individual was comfortable around blood and skilled with a knife. He went on to say that this man's personality would be that of a compulsive, inflexible, conscientious, and very patient man. Douglas said that he most likely did like a drink, and when he did drink too much, he became confrontational. He also said that he may have had significant stresses in his life at this time and been under duress. One of those stresses particularly could have been financial stress. Douglas stated that there could also be a possibility of this man already having a criminal record of threatening someone with a knife. Johnny Douglas went on to say that this individual and Betty most likely spent several days together. They had been drinking and socializing, and maybe either she had rejected him in some way, said something to trigger him, or possibly poked fun at him, which may have given also those personal stresses at the time, fueled by the possibility of alcohol, have been the final straw for this man that sent him into a senseless, murderous rage. Douglas believes that cutting the body in two was most likely for easy transportation. Yet the level of abuse to her body and the mutilation was a direct reflection of his unadulterated rage against Betty in particular. Douglas went on to state that the way he treated Betty before and during the mutilation after her death was to humiliate her and dehumanize her, down to using the Chelsea smile. Douglas said, "You can almost imagine him saying, "Look who's having the last laugh now," or something to that effect. Douglas also believed that the dumping site was deliberate and possibly connected to the killer, that he may have had a significant disdain for that area, because he then raised the question, why else would he choose such a highly populated residential area to dispose of the body in such a public way? As well as questioning why there were also no more killings like Betty's in LA at that time or after. Douglas suspected that he either became very ill, died, or was never triggered/stressed to that level of rage again. As we know, Douglas does go on to say himself that that profile is not perfect. However, not only does it raise some very interesting questions and points. When I tell you all about Walter Bailey, you may agree with me that Douglas's profile was way more on the money than he could have initially thought. Okay, back to Larry. So one day in particular, Larry received a letter that contained a photocopy of a marriage certificate. And this marriage certificate was a marriage between a Virginia Short, which happened to be Betty's sister, and a man named Adrian West. It was dated February 28th, 1945. At first, Larry didn't think too much about this, as he had received, as you can imagine, countless of documents, and because it was a photocopy, he didn't know whether it was necessarily going to be real. One day in particular, Larry received a letter that contained a photocopy of a marriage certificate. This certificate was a marriage between Virginia Short, Betty's sister, and a man named Adrian West. It was dated February 28, 1945. Larry does get curious one day, and he looks into this letter even further. He then finds out it gave an address of a home in Inglewood, where the wedding ceremony of this couple took place. When Larry saw that address and looked into it, he said, "My blood ran cold," as this address was South Norton Avenue, only 1 block away from where Elizabeth Short's body was found. Larry went on then to verify that the marriage certificate was indeed legitimate, because it was a photocopy, and it turned out that it was. The letter was addressed to a woman named Barbara Lindgren. Now Larry had to find out who Barbara was. He first went to the children of Adrian and Virginia West, who would have been Betty Short's nieces and nephews. He explained the situation and the backstory to them, and discovered that their parents married in quite a hurried fashion after World War II. And it was by a minister from Adrian's church. The home where the wedding took place was of a couple from the church, and some guests were also members of that church, including a Barbara Lindgren. Larry then discovered that the home where the wedding took place belonged to a woman named Ruth Bailey, who was Barbara's mother. And there is the link to Walter Bailey, because Walter Bailey was Ruth Bailey's ex-husband and Barbara's father. There already you have the links. He knows the Short family. He has a link to the Short family. He once lived in that home, would explain the connection to the area, and also the aforementioned by Douglas, the possible disdain for the area. And one of the most significant things, which really kind of took my breath away when I found this out, Walter Bailey was a skilled surgeon, a highly skilled surgeon who had worked through the wars, as well as a residential chief doctor in several hospitals. So Walter Bailey was looking more and more like this suspect that Larry had been looking for all along. This blew my mind when I found out that he was a skilled surgeon, because Not only does he begin to fit this profile more and more, but he wasn't only a skilled surgeon, he actually, for a period of time in his career, specialised in women's surgery in particular. And as I mentioned before, he went on to have a very successful career during the wars, as well as becoming a chief resident surgeon in a prestigious hospital. So Walter was doing very well for himself for a period of time. However, in 1946, just a year before the death of Elizabeth Short, things would turn sour for Walter quite significantly. He lost his role as chief resident surgeon, which meant he was under significant financial duress, which, if we reflect back to Douglas's profile, he did mention that the individual in question could be under financial strain. This was a stressor. And when we look at stressors, especially when profilers talk about them when killers snap, they look at triggers and stressors. And this was a huge stressor for Walter Bailey. Not only that, but then he comes across and meets a woman who was a nurse by the name of Alexandra Patrick. Now, I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Sorry if I didn't. But he ends up having an affair with this woman and she becomes his mistress. He is discovered, and then that leads to the breakdown of his marriage, and he ends up then getting a divorce and moving out of the family home. So here we have the exact reasons that Walter could have been having this breakdown and significant stresses in his life. He loses a significant role. He ends up having an affair, and the potential shame that that could bring on him for cheating on his wife and getting a divorce. He's breakdown of a marriage that he had for many years, moving out of the family home. These are all huge things to happen in a person's life. But it actually gets even more complicated because it was found out, and this is actually what Walter Bailey ended up dying of, is that he was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. And not only just Alzheimer's, but he also had another condition that was known to shrink the brain. And in some research, it stated that that could happen from a brain injury or a head trauma. Again, this is a pattern that if you are a true crime fan, or if you've looked into other killers and specifically serial killers, even though Walter wasn't one, but if you look at the serial killers, a lot of them do end up having brain injuries or head traumas in childhood or in adulthood that then completely changes their personality. If we put that together with the stresses in his life, the Alzheimer's, plus this other condition, people did say he changed significantly just before he died and in those later years before his death. It was also particularly mentioned that Walter Bailey was significantly jaded and desensitized when it came to things like surgeries and gore and blood and graphic violence. It was even said that he would sit with his mistress during their evening meal watching autopsies and surgeries taking place. Now, again, the minute I heard that, I couldn't help but think back to the fact that Elizabeth Short's body was thoroughly washed and cleaned. And during an autopsy, that is one of the things that happens to the body once, like at the end of the autopsy. So that's something, again, which significantly stuck in my mind and jumped out at me. He also went on to change his will. Now, he did that, again, around that same time. So, shortly before his death, which just want to put out there, he died in 1948, the year after Elizabeth Short was killed. So, just before he died, he changes his will to leave everything to his mistress, not his daughter, not anything to his wife from his previous marriage. And the claim at the time was that, and I quote, Alexandra knew a terrible secret about him that he would not want anyone else to know. So that's also another huge factor when it comes to looking at why Walter Bailey is most likely the most probable and significant suspect when it comes to looking at who killed poor Elizabeth Short, who was the killer of the notorious case of the Black Dahlia. And yes, there have been many other suspects, and if you look at other content, you may come across others. But when we look at this case, the location, the breakdown in his marriage, the stresses that he had with his financial issues, the shame of cheating and getting a divorce, the Alzheimer's, the other brain condition that affected him greatly, and was also known that people that have that condition are prone to random acts of violence that are, let's say, uncalled for. The surgical position in which she was dismembered, and the fact that her body was clean, as well as being left with a Chelsea smile. And he has a connection to the Short family. All those things linked up together, to me, and I'm sure to quite a few other people, makes Walter Bailey the most likely suspect. And after all this time, and after I thought I knew so much about this case, finding this information out was just like a complete penny drop moment to me. So this wraps up this immense, notorious, infamous case of what happened to poor Betty Short, who ultimately was very, very young and didn't have a very much of a life at all before something horrifically horrible happened to her. And it is believed that it did happen at the hands of Walter Bailey. Thank you so much for staying with me today, joining me, hanging out with me, and listening to me talk about this case. I really appreciate it. For those that have come along and watched this, I am so, so grateful. And I hope that you come along again for another one of my videos. As you know, this channel is one that covers everything from anything spooky, scary, mysterious, and weird. So it's quite a range of topics that I will look at. True crime will come and go from time to time, but it won't be the only thing that I discuss. This one I wanted to get my teeth into because A, I did think I knew a lot about it, and B, it's just a fascinating mystery that has gone on for so many years. So I hope you enjoyed it today. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.